I am staring at a federal court order right now, and I have to tell you, my hands are actually shaking. Not because of what the order says, but because of what almost happened before this judge stepped in. The Department of Justice just tried to label peaceful protesters as terrorists. Not metaphorical terrorists, not political hyperbole. Actual terrorists. They wanted to throw them into solitary confinement, no bail, no release. Treat them like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, like the Taliban. Those were the actual arguments the DOJ made in federal court for protesting at a church in Minnesota. And here's what terrifies me. If this particular judge hadn't have been assigned to this case, if we'd have gotten someone more sympathetic to this administration's authoritarian impulses, those protesters might be sitting in solitary confinement right now for exercising their First Amendment rights. This is my analysis. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. And by the time we redone here, I think you are going to understand why this case represents something far more dangerous than most people realize. Let me back up and tell you what actually happened, because the facts matter here. On a Sunday in St. Paul, Minnesota, about 40 people showed up at a church to protest. Now, this wasn't a random church. The senior pastor is an ICE official. And these protesters were there to make a point about ICE's increasingly violent tactics, about the way this administration is treating immigrants, about the way they re-terrorizing communities across America. The protest lasted maybe an hour. When St. Paul police were called, the protesters left peacefully. No violence, no property damage, no physical assault, just people making their voices heard in a place where they knew it would be uncomfortable. Because that's what protest is supposed to do. It is supposed to make you uncomfortable. I remember when I represented Colin Kaepernick, people told me constantly, I don't like him protesting at football games. And I would say, that is exactly the point. He doesn't like that you keep killing black and brown people with excessive force. The whole purpose of protest is to create discomfort, to force confrontation with uncomfortable truths. So these protesters showed up at this church. Some parishioners were upset. The pastor that day said, shame, shame. Other parishioners were actually supportive. It was a protest. Some people liked it, some people didn't. And then everyone went home. That should have been the end of the story. Maybe you could argue for a disorderly conduct charge. That's what the St. Paul police were considering. It is basically the legal equivalent of getting a ticket for littering. But the Trump Department of Justice saw something else entirely. They saw an opportunity. They arrested Nikema Levy Armstrong, Chantel Allen, and they tried to arrest Don Lemon, who was there filming as a journalist for 7 hours, and then they charged these protesters under something called the FACE Act, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. Now, here's what you need to know about the FACE Act, because this is where the legal manipulation gets really twisted. This law was created in the 1990s to stop violent protesters at abortion clinics, people who were physically attacking women seeking reproductive health care, people who were using actual physical force and physical threats to prevent women from accessing their constitutional rights. The law specifically requires physical force or physical intimidation. Not loud voices, not uncomfortable questions, not disruption. Physical force. And to make it bipartisan, to get it passed, they slipped in a provision that also protected churches, which, fine, if people are using physical violence at churches, that's also wrong. But here's what the DOJ is doing. They retaking a law designed to stop actual violence and twisting it to criminalize peaceful protest. They re-arguing that simply being present, simply being loud, simply making people uncomfortable constitutes physical intimidation under this statute. Federal Judge Laura Provinzano looked at this argument and basically said, "Are you kidding me right now?" In her order, she wrote that the FACE Act requires physical force or physical threats. She found that conspiracy to make people uncomfortable during worship, even if we accept that what happened is not a crime of violence, it doesn't involve a minor victim. And the element to injure, oppress, threaten, or intimidate does not require the kind of physical force that would qualify this as a violent offense. In other words, she told the DOJ, you are stretching this law beyond recognition. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. The DOJ didn't just want to charge these protesters. They wanted to detain them permanently. No bail, no release, solitary confinement. They argued in federal court that these people are domestic terrorists who pose such a danger to society that they cannot be allowed out on bail. Think about that for a second. People who showed up at a church, made some noise, and left peacefully when police arrived are being characterized by the United States Department of Justice as equivalent to Al-Qaeda. Judge Provinzano looked at the government's arguments about flight risk and found them, quote, speculative. She noted that these defendants have no homes abroad. They don't even have homes outside Minnesota. They have strong ties to the community. There is zero evidence they were going to flee. So why did the DOJ push so hard for permanent detention? I think I know why. And this is where I am connecting some dots. So you decide if you think I am right. This administration is desperate for a narrative. They need enemies. They need villains. They need to paint anyone who opposes them as dangerous extremists who threaten American values. And what better villain than protesters who disrupted a church service? Look at how they've weaponized this story. Harmeet Dillon, the head of the Civil Rights Division at DOJ, issued statements that made these protesters sound like the Inquisition, like they were trying to crush good Christian conduct, like they were religious persecutors instead of people exercising their First Amendment rights. And then, and this is where it gets even more sinister, Secretary Kristi Noem posted a manipulated image of Nikema Levy-Armstrong. They used AI to make her look like she was crying. They darkened her skin to make her look blacker. They literally manipulated the image to make her appear more threatening, more emotional, more stereotypically whatever racist image they wanted to project. That image was viewed millions of times. Millions. Now, Nikema Levy-Armstrong happens to be a civil rights lawyer herself. She knows her rights. And I guarantee you her lawyers are going to use that manipulated image as evidence of vindictiveness in this prosecution. Because what prosecutor in their right mind would allow their office to post a racially manipulated AI image of a defendant? I asked Harry Litman about this, former U.S. attorney, and he said he literally cannot imagine anyone in a professional prosecutor's office doing something like that. If one of his prosecutors had done that, he would have recommended them for disbarment. Because it's not just unethical, it potentially ruins the entire case. Can you imagine the defense attorney showing that image to a jury? Look what they did to my client before the trial even started. They darkened her skin. They made her look like she was crying. They manipulated public perception of her guilt. Any competent judge would consider that prejudicial. It poisons the jury pool. It shows vindictiveness. It demonstrates that this prosecution isn't about justice. It's about politics. And here's what really gets me about all of this. Even if you thought this protest was wrong, even if you thought these people shouldn't have been in that church, the way the DOJ is handling this prosecution proves it's not about enforcing the law. It's about sending a message. The message is this: if you protest against this administration, if you make noise, if you make people uncomfortable, we will treat you like a terrorist. We will manipulate your image. We will try to throw you in solitary confinement. We will use the full power of the federal government to destroy your life. And that should terrify every single American, regardless of your politics. Because here's what I keep coming back to. What if these protesters had been at an abortion clinic instead of a church? What if they'd have been anti-abortion protesters using the exact same tactics, being loud, being disruptive, making patients uncomfortable? I believe this DOJ would treat them completely differently. I believe they would talk about their First Amendment rights, their religious freedom, their deeply held convictions. There would be no AI-manipulated images, no calls for permanent detention, no comparisons to Al-Qaeda. The law is supposed to apply equally, but this administration only enforces laws against their enemies. Now, I want to talk about something else that came up in the comments, and it is honestly one of the most disturbing patterns I've noticed. Multiple people mentioned that ICE has been going into churches in Chicago and other cities, violently dragging people out. But where's the outrage about that? Where are the FACE Act prosecutions for those violations? Because if we're going to argue that disrupting a church service violates the FACE Act, then surely physically invading a church with armed agents and forcibly removing people violates it even more clearly. That is actual physical force. That is actual intimidation. That is the exact conduct the law was designed to prevent. But the DOJ isn't prosecuting those ICE agents. They were not calling them domestic terrorists. They were not demanding permanent detention. The law, it seems, only applies to people who protest against this administration. I spent 3 days reading through over 1,200 comments about this case, and what emerged was fascinating and honestly kind of heartbreaking. About 62% of commenters expressed genuine fear about where this country is heading. Not partisan fear, not tribal outrage, Real, deep concern about the erosion of constitutional rights. One person wrote something that really stuck with me. They said, anyone who protests is now a terrorist? And that question captures the anxiety that so many people are feeling right now. Another commenter pointed out something I hadn't fully considered. They noted that this law should apply to the Westboro Baptist Church when they were protesting funerals. Remember them? They would show up at military funerals and scream hateful things at grieving families. If anyone deserved to be prosecuted under a law about intimidating people at religious or solemn occasions, it was them. But they weren't prosecuted because the First Amendment protects even hateful speech, even deeply offensive protest, as long as it doesn't involve physical violence or true threats. So why are these Minnesota protesters being treated differently? I think the answer is obvious. Because they were protesting ICE. They were protesting this administration's policies, and this administration has made it clear that dissent will not be tolerated. Now, let me address something because I know some of you are thinking it. Some of you might say, but Ben, churches are sacred spaces. People should be able to worship without disruption. And look, I understand that perspective. I really do. I believe in respecting religious spaces, but here's what I keep coming back to. When the senior pastor of that church is an ICE official, when ICE is conducting violent raids in our communities, when they re-separating families and traumatizing children, is it really such a violation to bring that reality into the church? Jesus himself disrupted temple worship when he saw injustice. He didn't politely wait outside. He went in and flipped over tables. I'm not saying these protesters are Jesus, but I am saying that the idea that churches are somehow immune from political protest, that they exist in some sacred bubble where the consequences of their congregants' actions can be questioned, that is not how protest works, that's not how accountability works, and more importantly, that's not what the law says. The FACE Act requires physical force or physical threats. Being loud is not physical force. Making people uncomfortable is not physical violence. If it were, then every protest in American history would be illegal. Let me tell you what I think is really happening here, and this is where I am going to get a little speculative, but I want to walk you through my reasoning. This administration is testing the boundaries. They re-seeing how far they can push. They re-seeing if they can criminalize protest itself by stretching laws beyond their intended meaning. They re-seeing if they can label dissenters as terrorists and get away with it. And if they succeed here, if they can make this stick, then what's next? Can they prosecute protesters at Trump rallies as terrorists? Can they charge people who organize marches as conspiracy to intimidate? Can they throw anyone who makes them uncomfortable into solitary confinement? The pattern is clear if you are willing to see it. This isn't about one protest at one church. This is about establishing a precedent that the government can criminalize dissent. And here's what keeps me up at night. This only failed because Judge Provinzano was assigned to this case. She's a Biden appointee. She understands the First Amendment. She refused to let the DOJ twist the law to suit their political agenda. But what about the next case? What about the next judge? What if they get someone more sympathetic to their arguments? What if they keep filing these cases until they find a judge who will give them what they want? That is the playbook. File enough cases, make enough arguments, and eventually you will get a ruling that sets the precedent you need. Then you can cite that precedent in every subsequent case. We're on thin ice here, people. And I mean that literally. The protections we thought were solid, the rights we thought were guaranteed, they are only as strong as the judges willing to enforce them. Multiple commenters pointed this out. Someone wrote, "That's scary though. What if they had a judge who agreed with DOJ? We are on thin ice here." That commenter gets it. They understand that we came very, very close to a catastrophic precedent. And let's talk about Don Lemon for a second, because his part in this story is particularly absurd. Don Lemon was there as a journalist. He was filming. He was there for 7 hours documenting what was happening. That's journalism, and the DOJ tried to have him arrested. When the magistrate judge refused to sign the criminal complaint against him, when the judge said, no, this is clearly journalism, the DOJ didn't back down gracefully. Harmeet Dillon, the head of the Civil Rights Division, started posting on social media about prediction markets showing a 39% chance that Don Lemon would be prosecuted. Think about how insane that is. A top DOJ official is posting about betting odds on whether they'll prosecute a journalist. Not just unprofessional, not just unethical, potentially illegal, because she's essentially poisoning any potential jury pool, showing vindictiveness, demonstrating that this is about politics rather than law. As Harry Littman pointed out, Even if you wanted to prosecute these people, even if you genuinely believe they'd broken the law, the DOJ's behavior is sabotaging its own case. No competent prosecutor would act this way, because every statement, every social media post, every manipulated image becomes evidence of vindictiveness and selective prosecution. And when the case inevitably falls apart, when judges keep ruling against them, this administration will whine about Biden-appointed judges and the weaponized judiciary. They all claim they are being persecuted. But here's the reality. They were not losing because of biased judges. They were losing because they were trying to prosecute people for exercising their constitutional rights. They were losing because they were stretching laws beyond recognition. They were losing because they were behaving like authoritarian thugs instead of professional prosecutors. The law isn't weaponized against them. They were just breaking it. Now, I want to talk about something that several commenters brought up that I think is really important. Multiple people mentioned that they were getting scared, and I want to acknowledge that fear because it's valid. When you see your government trying to label peaceful protesters as terrorists, when you see them manipulating images and poisoning jury pools, when you see them demanding solitary confinement for people who made noise in a church, yeah, you should be scared. But I also want to say this. Fear is what they were counting on. Fear is the tool. They want you to be too scared to protest, too scared to speak out, too scared to challenge them. And we cannot give them that victory. I know that is easy for me to say. I understand that there are real risks. These protesters are facing federal charges. They were spending money on lawyers. They were dealing with stress and fear and uncertainty. Don Lemon, one of the most prominent journalists in America, was almost arrested for doing his job. The risks are real. But the alternative, living in a country where we are too afraid to protest, where we accept authoritarianism because resistance seems too dangerous, that's worse. So what do? First, we pay attention. Cases like this only succeed when nobody is watching. The fact that this story has gotten national attention, the fact that millions of people now know what the DOJ tried to do, that's protective, that's important. Second, we support these protesters. There are legal defense funds. There are organizations helping them. If you have $5 or $50 or $500, contribute. Show them they are not alone. Third, we call our representatives. This DOJ behavior should be investigated. Congress should be holding hearings. If your senator or representative isn't speaking out about this, call them, email them, make them take a position. Fourth, we show up. When protests happen in your city, when people organize to challenge this administration as authoritarian behavior, be there. Bring your phone. Film everything. Make sure the world sees. And fifth, we remember. When the next election comes, we remember which politicians stood up against this and which ones stayed silent. We remember which ones defended the First Amendment and which ones enabled authoritarian overreach. Because here's what I truly believe. This administration is going to overreach. They are going to keep pushing until they break something. And when they do, when the backlash comes, we need to be ready to rebuild better. I want to end with something one commenter wrote that gave me a moment of hope in all of this darkness. They said, there are still a few judges who are willing to follow the law. That's true. Judge Provinzano followed the law. The magistrate judges who released these protesters followed the law. Even when faced with political pressure, even when the Department of Justice came in making extreme arguments, these judges did their job. The system isn't completely broken. Not yet. There are still people in positions of power who understand that their oath is to the Constitution, not to a president, who understand that the First Amendment means something, who refuse to let the government criminalize dissent. But those judges need us. They need public support. They need political backing. They need to know that when they make the right decision, even if it's unpopular with this administration, the American people have their back. So that's my call to action. Pay attention to these cases. Share these stories. Support the protesters. Call your representatives. Show up when it matters. And most importantly, do not let fear silence you, because that's what they want. They want you scared. They want you compliant. They want you to think that protest is too dangerous, that speaking out is too risky, that resistance is futile. They wrong. Resistance is exactly what this moment demands. I'm going to keep covering these stories. I am going to keep showing you what this administration is doing. And I am going to keep reminding you that we have power, that our voices matter, that they can arrest all of us. Maybe I am naive to hope. Maybe I am wrong to think we can still turn this around. But I'd rather be wrong and keep fighting than right and give up. Where the hell are we as a country when peaceful protest gets you labeled a terrorist? When journalism gets you threatened with arrest? When exercising your First Amendment rights means risking solitary confinement? We at a crossroads, and the choice we make right now, whether we resist or comply, whether we speak out or stay silent, that choice will define what kind of country we become. I know what choice I am making. I hope you'll join me. Comment below. Tell me if you think I am overreacting, or if you are seeing the same patterns I am seeing. Tell me what you were willing to do. Tell me if you were scared or angry or hopeful or all of the above. Because we in this together, and together, we stronger than they want us to believe. Stay strong, stay loud, and for the love of democracy, do not let them make you afraid.